Welcome to Transformed and Transformational, a Teach Beyond podcast. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities. Kian, I know you are really excited about our topic today, so tell us more about it.
Yeah, I am super interested in this topic, and it's not because I know anything about it as much as it just raises so many interesting questions to me. Especially as my connections with other parts of the world have been growing, I'm trying to have a better understanding of the origins of my theology and kind of trying to wrap my mind around what it means. What is direct biblical theology and what is cultural theology?
Yeah, this is such a big topic, even thinking about what theology is, and then to dive into the nuances of culture and how that impacts what we believe about God and how we read scripture and all of this. I'm really excited to dive into this today, too.
Yeah, can't imagine that we will answer all of our questions in today's episode, but I'm so
Right.
excited to just have this initial conversation and get some of my questions answered and get this conversation started.
Yeah. Our guest today is Dr. Steve Pardue, who has served with Teach Beyond in the Philippines for over a decade. Steve teaches at the International Graduate School of Leadership and Asia Graduate School of Theology.
Steve earned a bachelor's degree in ancient languages, a master's in historical and systematic theology, and a doctorate in systematic theology, all from Wheaton College in Illinois.
Steve lives with his wife and 4 kids in Manila. Let's go over to the conversation with Steve now. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, Steve. We are so excited to have you and excited to have this conversation today. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are and how you ended up? You're in the Philippines, so how did you end up in the Philippines?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my story is a little longer than most. My family actually moved to the southern Philippines when I was 2 months old to help plant churches and do discipleship ministry. And so that was home for me basically until college. But then ended up coming back after college and graduate school and more graduate school and landed in 2012 at 2 seminaries, actually. International Graduate School of Leadership is a seminary that trains pastors and teachers, missionaries, business people from all around Asia. And then they actually collaborate with several other seminaries to form a consortium called the Asia Graduate School of Theology. And the Lord, through a process of discernment with our church and community, led my wife and I back here. My wife grew up here as well, but we're both American by passport, I guess. So that's how we got here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the uniqueness of these schools and kind of what the seminaries are about?
Yeah, sure. So the Philippines is has for most of the 20th century been kind of a major hub for theological education, for training, and for sending missionaries out. So all the way back in the 60s, 70s, you had these seminaries forming that were really serving not just the Philippines and the Filipino church, but leaders from Thailand and Cambodia, so Southeast Asia, but then also all the way over to Pakistan, Nepal, etc., China, because we have an environment of relative freedom and openness here, as compared to most other places in Asia. That led to sort of the founding of a lot of seminaries here. So IGSL, I would say what's fun about that school is that it is, first of all, 50% international and 50% Filipino. So super diverse. There's people from every nation in Asia there. And it's, so that just gives it a really fun flavor. AGST is also, similarly diverse. It's a little smaller. It's more focused on training people who are in faculty or leadership roles. So they offer doctorates and things like that. And so also just super delightful. You're meeting people who are from all walks of, every culture you can think of. And they're kind of rubbing shoulders with each other. And it's just a super fun place to be a teacher. I love it.
Yeah. Do you have specific classes that you teach or things that stay the same year to year?
Over the last, we've been here 11 years, so it's changed a fair bit over the years. But mostly I teach in the area of theology, church history, sometimes Bible, if that's needed. Obviously, we use the Bible a lot in the theology class. But, there are also separate classes, about just about the Bible specifically. But
Sure.
yeah, so anything in that area.
Great. Yeah. Well, Steve, you recently wrote a book called Why Evangelical Theology Needs the Global Church. And
Yeah.
so we'd love to hear kind of the background of that. What led you to write that book? What prompted writing a book at all? We'd love to hear that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking. So, I guess the story starts when I was finishing my PhD. I was teaching at Wheaton College, where I was finishing grad school and teaching undergraduates. And I just taught kind of one of their basic theology classes, part of the core studies that all students do. And I had a great time. And one of the things I would do every couple of weeks was I would try to bring in a theologian from outside of the Western context for
Mm-hmm.
students to engage with. And I kind of tried to send the message, look, this is really where you want to look. If you want to look at sort of where the next generation of theological discourse is really emerging and where the church is vital and kind of producing really interesting reflection on scripture, look to the majority world. And to their credit, these students listened to me. So they would come to
Mm-hmm.
me and say, okay, well, where can I find more? And at that time, this was 2012, it was actually very hard to find resources that would expose sort of the average American student to voices from the majority world. So I set about with a couple of colleagues to create a book series called the Majority World Theology Series, and that really kicked off 6 years of sort of every year we would gather a group together from most of the continents, focus on a
Mm-hmm.
topic, and then produce a book out of that. And eventually that all culminated in a big book called Majority World Theology that was published in 2020. Really was received well, and we were really excited about that. So it felt like we solved that access problem in a small way. Now, I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
huge ground to cover, but as I talk to people, students and other colleagues, both in the West and here in Asia, I actually found that there was a step missing in the discussion because a lot of people still came to that book and to those resources and said, "This is interesting, but why do I need it? Why not just do theology from the Bible? And what does culture have to do with any of it?" And sometimes there's even some suspicion or antagonism, like some worry, I would say, that culture is going to sort of skew our perspective on
Mm-hmm.
God and maybe even create an idol of our own making. And so I really set out to write this book to explain, how to answer that question. How does culture matter for theology, and why is that not necessarily a threat, but actually a gift from God
Mm-hmm.
for God's people to use as a church from every tribe and tongue and nation gets together, worships, proclaims the gospel, and perceives the gospel in really deep and rich ways, but very different ways.
I love this. This is so interesting. I have so many questions, but to just start us off at the very, very first basic level,
Sure.
you have used the term majority world a
Mm,
bit,
yeah.
and I'm not so familiar with it. I have heard like the term global south, but
Yes.
what does majority world
Yeah.
mean in your the way you use it?
Great question. And it's great to get that jargon out of the way. So, basically, for several decades, there have been discussions about how to term the sort of different parts of the world that we tend to refer to when we talk about. So, it used to be the old way was first world and third world, and with the second world, I guess, being communist bloc countries. That morphed to global north, global south, or east or west. None of those are perfect. They all have some
Mm-hmm.
problems. I mean, north and south doesn't work that well because actually there are parts of that you're trying to refer to that are not in the southern hemisphere. So I guess I don't know a lot about the history, but majority world is basically a way of describing the where most people in the world actually live, which is Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And that's in contrast with the minority world, which is North America and Europe, where many fewer people live. But it's not to say that they're less important. It's just to say this is the reality. And I guess there is a reality in theology, at least, that even though most people and even most Christians live outside of the West, right now, most theological literature is still really focused on North Americans and Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
That was why we used that term when we started publishing those books, and I think it's as good a term as we have right now.
Yeah, thank you. That is really helpful. As we're talking about this in Western theology, There's a story I've heard that I think about where they describe two fish swimming along, and one fish looks at the other one and says, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "Water? What's water?"
Yeah.
And it's just you don't know what you're in
Mhm.
without somebody telling you.
Yeah.
And I think about that with the term Western theology. So
Mhm.
can you help us understand what you mean by Western theology,
Mhm.
what that looks like?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great analogy for culture in general, right? That most of us sort of
Right.
walk around with these set of assumptions that we carry with us, and we don't even realize they're there. They're just invisible kind of frameworks for how we live our lives and what we think is reasonable or not reasonable. The first thing to say, I guess, is Western theology. By that term, I generally mean theology that originates from and is focused on the questions, problems, issues that come up in the minority world, North America and Europe. Whereas majority world theology is a catch-all term. Now, obviously, majority world is not all one thing; it's a bunch of things. Even
Mhm.
Yeah.
Asia, where I live, is extremely diverse. But in general, that's the idea. And of course, Christianity does have a really important, valuable, and long-term legacy in the West, in Europe and North America. But actually, if you turn the clock back far enough, you learn that it also has a really important history in Asia, in parts of Africa, there at least. And then Latin America is a little trickier. But so Christianity has actually always been a global faith. I guess one way to think about this is that there was just a season where we didn't realize that. We forgot that for a while. And it's been
Mhm.
kind of rediscovered now in the 20th century with globalization this
Mm.
huge interconnectedness of people from every place. I think we've been able to recover our understanding that Christianity is actually a world faith. It's a global faith.
Mhm.
And it was
Mhm.
designed that way from the beginning.
That's so good. One of the concerns you brought up initially with people kind of raising the concern of like, why are we even doing this? Why don't we just do theology from the Bible?
Yeah.
Can you talk about why why that maybe is not possible, or like
Yeah.
what that
Yeah.
looks like to try and do, pure theology just from the Bible, not impacted by any culture?
Yeah, yeah, I'll do my best, but I would say
Sure.
if there are gaps here, go read chapter 1 of the book and
Ah, yes, good.
enjoy the longer version. But um, yeah, and the first thing I'll say is this isn't a question that only comes up from Western Christians. Although
Mm.
it is the case that often Christians in the West, because the West is so culturally dominant in the world of theological studies, they tend to be less aware of their culture. So they tend to be more like that fish in the joke. But this can be true anywhere. In fact, I had a student, one of the things that really said, I need to write this book was I had a student from China who we were talking about the role, I was asking him, how does culture impact your theology? And he says, well, yeah, it impacts it by telling me what not to do. Because for him, he was leaving behind, he was a first generation Christian. He was trying to escape from a lot of the things that felt like traps and burdens to him that were associated with his culture. And so in that vision, the more Christian he became, the less Chinese he became. Um, so yeah, why is this a mistake? I think fundamentally it's a mistake because uh, this isn't God's design for how humans are supposed to talk about Him, worship Him, love Him, proclaim the good news, and even understand the good news. And we know that because in Scripture itself, think about where does culture come up in the Bible? The place it comes up the first, where it's really strong, is the Tower of Babel. And so here you have this scattering, this division, right? Splintering into cultures. And you might think from just reading that maybe culture is an enemy to escape, right? It's this thing that we need to get rid of so we can all be one again. But when you fast forward to the New Testament, and actually you have on the day of Pentecost, Babel is kind of undone. It's reversed in these really interesting ways. And if you look at the text, you can see intentional parallels there. And but the reversal of Babel is not what you expect. It's not the return to some monolingual, monocultural past. And Jesus doesn't come actually to establish a new Israel in the sense of some new people that all has one language and one set of customs and all that. He actually comes to establish a people that is really mixed, right? Really culturally diverse. And Acts 2 celebrates this. And if you're unsure still whether that's still sort of part of God's design, then fast forward a little further in the biblical narrative to Revelation. And there in Revelation 7, you have this people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And what you see is, as John is narrating this, he sees their cultural distinction still, right? So think about that. Even in redeemed humanity, our cultural distinction persists. That's part of how we worship God. We still worship with one song, but in different languages, in different ways, with different dynamics. So that's one short answer to say culture matters to God. It's part of his design for how we talk about him and how we do theology.
Now let's take a short break for a story from the field.
2012 I finished that MBA, and it was the major was human resource management. Then I thought like I need to go somewhere that I can practice what I have learned. So I decided to go any company or any international organization. So within few months I got that chance to work in a government sector as a HR and compliance department as an executive. So when I joined, it was my first job. So like I was super busy with all the tasks they're doing. I need to go to office early morning and come back at midnight. And when I went to office, like I always see my kids are sleeping, and when I come back, I see they are sleeping. And my wife, he said like if your job is going this way, so your children will call you uncle. So they will not call you papa or father. And I was not that kind of like minded. So I was caring about my career, So I was doing what I wanted to do. And it was like it was 2016, near about 3 years gone. Suddenly I'm thinking, the thought came my mind, like what I am doing over here. This is the purpose that God made me, or this is my plan that I am doing this job over here. So, and I was thinking, and how I was kind of sad, like what I'm doing is like busy life. I'm wasting my time, and the last 3 years, maybe 2 or 3 times I went to church. So that was kind of it was burden for me, and I was struggling. I was wrestling with myself, and I was praying, God, what do you want to do? Like, is that your plan, or is that my plan? That is that story that I wanted to write, or what is your story that you wrote for me and I want to execute? And suddenly I thought, oh, I'm doing wrong thing. This is not the right story that God wrote for me. I'm writing my own story. And I was praying, and within 2 weeks I received a phone call from the school. So they said like, are you interested to work in school again? I said yes. Let me think, because I had to sacrifice many things, my salary, my career. I was working as a senior executive, and I talked to my uncle, he is a pastor. Then I talked to Hannah and my wife, and I was praying for that, and I decided that okay, I will left this and I will join again, because I need family, we need a church, like that was missing from my life. And I joined, and administration is my passion. I love to work in administration. So I joined as a teacher 2016. 2017, my administration team called me and they said, are you willing to serve in administration team? I said, yes, why not? I'm looking for this and I'm passionate for that. And I decided, and I said yes, and now I'm serving as event coordinator, administration, and many things, many responsibilities I'm doing, and I'm very happy, and I have seen the God's plan in my life, and this is my story. Thank you for listening.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on Ukarumpa International School in Papua New Guinea. Want to join the team there? Click on the link in the show notes or visit teachbeyond.org/go. It seems like even entering into this, like kind of opening up our thinking about this. Okay, what assumptions or perspectives am I bringing in? Having that self awareness of where
Hmm.
culture is impacting my theology.
Hmm.
Not to say that that's bad, but to have awareness about it, right? If that's
Yeah.
what I'm hearing from you. What suggestions do you have then for Western Christians to enter into these conversations in a humble way to kind of identify what are those core beliefs that we share, and then maybe
Hmm.
what's more cultural? Yeah, what
Hmm.
are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a huge question. It's a great,
Yeah.
great question. So I think, I mean, the first thing I'll say is I do think awareness is a big piece of it, like you were narrating there. And I would say, in my experience, I think in most people's experience, the way that tends to happen is just it happens quite naturally when you interact with Christians from other cultures, and especially if you're not sort of the dominant voice there, and you're willing to let those other Christians set the agenda for you and ask questions. And so this can happen. I think a very simple way is to start reading theological books written by people from cultures that are not your own. And that'll very quickly sort of make you aware of some of the things that are kind of parochial and peculiar to your culture. Even better than that is if you're in a context where you can go and interact with and maybe have a really sort of partner relationship with someone in another culture, and that will actually bring it to life even more. Aside from that awareness piece, I would just say, I think, especially for Americans, I would just encourage people not to code this as a political correctness conversation, which can happen
Mm,
sometimes. And sometimes it's for good. People are saying, like, this is why we need to listen, etc. I would really want to root this in scripture and in Christian commitments. And that's what I argue in the book is that I'm all for civility, I'm all for kindness and generosity and all that. But actually, we have, as Christians, unique reasons to be really interested in culture and understanding our brothers and sisters from other faiths. It's part and parcel of the Christian identity from the book of Acts onward. And actually, you see this in the early church. You see people wondering, like, you have Romans writing about Christians. These are strange people. They don't have a country, they don't have a language of their own, but they do have some things that characterize them all, right? So from the very start, people were noticing this about us, and I hope that's something that we can recover as a reputation in the world.
So, okay, as you're talking, and this is maybe an assumption of mine, with the kind of Western dominant voice that exists almost globally, as you talk to local voices, you kind of said, like, just in conversation, you'll be able to hear their voice more. Is there something that needs to be encouraged as far as encouraging that voice to be strong, to say, like, your voice is important and matters
Mm-hmm.
versus saying, hey, I speak with a Western voice because I'm American, I'm European, so listen to my theology more than your own cultural voice? Is that a
Yeah.
conversation that needs to happen as you are in these
Yeah. No, that's a
situations?
great question. So I think my advice there is, yeah, I do think it's wise to, especially in places where the Western Church has a very dominant voice, and maybe in places where actually that has happened because of colonialism or histories of even economic kind of domination. It's really important for Western Christians to be sensitive to that, to think about it. And, a really easy way to alter that is to ask a lot of questions rather than make a lot of declarations. And like what I would also say is, aside from asking questions, really allow your local partners to set the agenda, right? So if you're going to have a conference or a conversation about theology, ask them, what are the theological issues you think are important?
yeah.
There is a overcorrection that can be made here where like sometimes people will insist uh, to local Christians, like, no, you shouldn't read this book or that book that's Western, you should read this other one. I really don't love that either. That's not, I don't think that, so it may be the case that some Western writer really resonates in a village in Ghana, right? That's going to happen, actually. And that's okay. I actually don't think, I think there can be like a reverse colonialism thing where you're like, no, let's stomp that out. Only read local writers. At the same time, yeah, to the degree we can, I think we want to encourage authentic partnership and fellowship across the nations. And that is, again, something that is uniquely Christian. That's something we've tried to do,
Mhm.
tried to embody as a church. And it's good to remember that's a human experiment. Like, no one did that until Christians did it. And it's a pretty cool thing to have as part of our legacy.
That's great. As you were talking earlier, you mentioned how kind of originally, historically, Christianity was a more of a global religion. It was
Mm-hmm.
present in Asia, present in Africa. So I'm a Messianic Jew. So when
Mm.
I talk to Christians, evangelical Christians who have no Jewish heritage, they find it fascinating. They're super interested. They're like, oh, answer all of these questions about how Jewish people view these scriptures.
Yes.
So there is some inherent understanding that like Christianity started in the Middle East. There's some
Yep.
understanding that it's like a Jewish origins, but then I found that interest kind of then goes, it's like Middle East and then Western. There's not a lot of curiosity of, hey, we're all kind of getting it secondhand from the original Jewish culture, and then we're all on the same
Mm-hmm.
plane versus then the Western's the next voice. Is there any thoughts of why that might happen or ways to encourage a similar understanding of you're interested in the Jewish perspective, maybe also be interested in the Asian perspective, the African
Yeah.
perspective, the Western perspective in a similar way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I mean, it gets at this actually interesting dynamic with evangelical Christianity that in some ways it's a movement that is very aware of culture, right? Like, it's
Mhm.
aware of Jewish culture, right? As you're pointing out, sometimes in strange ways, fixations on kind of interesting things, right? And it's also very aware of culture in terms of missions, right? So most evangelicals are really passionate about getting the gospel into people's hands in a way they can understand, in a language they get it, right? So it's actually interesting that then when it comes to doing theology or reflecting on the Bible, there's actually some worry about culture, right? And there actually is, like, you can document like people in the very early days of evangelicalism sort of trying to argue we can get culture out of theology and just kind of make it this pure abstract thing. So I think what we can do there is try to follow those good instincts that we have, that culture does matter, that culture impacts everything that we see, and that we receive the gospel not in some abstract kind of theorem that's beamed into our brains, but through a very specific language, culture. I mean, God comes to earth and speaks with an accent, right? And that's part of who we are as Christians, is we affirm that that's how God reveals himself. That actually dignifies culture as an element of the give and take of how we're supposed to operate.
Well, Steve, I'm wondering what theological insights you personally have gained as a result of working alongside other people with different cultural
Mm.
backgrounds, having these conversations authentically with the people who you know personally or know through the classroom. Would love to hear how this has personally impacted you and your own beliefs.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, there's so many kind of good little stories to share. I think one that's just recent is so I've had the pleasure of working as a series editor for a set of books that are targeting Asian seminaries. Although I think everybody should go read them. They're called Foundations in Asian Christian Thought. They're published by Langham Literature. And one that is like in the works right now that we're about to send to the printer is focused on the New Testament and sort of different Asian interactions with the New Testament. And one of them interacts with the issue of how to honor elders. And particularly in Asia, especially in places that have been influenced by Confucianism at all, there's actually this real problem that Christians always have, which is how do we interact with our tradition of honoring our elders? That often involves some sort of religious ceremonies, though not always. And so Christians for centuries in Asia have argued about how to manage that. And this author who's from Korea, I thought, just did a fantastic job of highlighting how in scripture, if you read it sort of aware of the issue of honoring elders, which actually is in Asia very similar to the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman world, right? A lot of things suddenly come alive. So, for example, the story of the prodigal son is not just this story of a bad. We all know he's a bad son, right? But we don't necessarily see that part of what's happening there is he's bringing shame and dishonor on his father and his older brother. But then his older brother is also bringing dishonor on his father by not doing the things that a good son would do in this situation, ultimately sort of compounding the pain of his father. And that was actually probably part of Jesus' original intention in that parable, was to show you, if you're living like the older brother, you're bringing shame on your heavenly father. And I don't know, it connected with me in a new way. It made me see that parable really differently. And it also prompts me to think about how in my passport culture, we do way too little, I think, to honor those who have gone before us in life and also in the faith. We tend to be, as Americans, like very forward facing people, just keep moving forward, which is ironic because actually we have this legacy of faith. Many of us do have, parents, grandparents, great grandparents who are in the faith, whereas many Asian believers, this is their first generation, maybe only second. They treasure that legacy in a way that we don't.
You've given us some ideas already of some practical next steps for each of us to take as we're engaging with this. Do you have any other practical suggestions? I'm known around here for asking the practical questions. So, any other practical suggestions for a next step for people who want to engage more deeply on this?
Sure. Yeah. So I do think number one is the most straightforward way to do this is pick up a book written by someone who's not from your culture. I'll put a plug in here for Langham Literature. They do an amazing job publishing majority world authors, and they're all available on Kindle, Amazon, or whatever you use. So that would be a good first step. But then after that, go look for real in the flesh people from other cultures that you can do church with, do small group with, do ministry with, and be intentional about just asking questions. And I think
Mm,
it'll unfold from there.
mm, mm. Are there specific ways that you have found that it's been helpful for people to connect with people who aren't, if they're not living outside of their passport culture and aren't
Mm.
really sure where to begin with that? How would you direct them to take the next step to interact with people from other places?
Yeah. Well, almost everywhere you live, I mean, this is one of the cool things about the 21st century. Almost anywhere, you'll be able to find people who have settled there from another place, and often that's refugees, or maybe it's people who have migrated for work. I guarantee you'll find a Filipino almost anywhere on the planet. They've migrated really widely, so I don't know. I mean, maybe a good way is like, and I think it's best to do this through local churches if you can.
Mm,
So
yeah.
find a local church that has some Christians who are not from your culture. Maybe it's a whole church, and just ask them, hey, can I join in on some stuff with you? And usually, I think that'll go well.
This is a great conversation, and I feel like this is just kind of starting of a mind shift. So I'm sure there's lots of follow-up questions, more thoughts we could have had. But
Hmm.
we're gonna have to end the conversation here. But before we let you go, we have one last question we ask everybody on our show, and that's what's one thing that's changing your life right now. So that can be something really big, something dramatic, or something small and light, kind of wherever you want to take it. So I'll go first. You have a little bit of time to think about it. But something that's changing my life and actually leads right into our conversation is I saw a friend from college who is serving in Colombia working with Indigenous voices and theology from Indigenous voices. And it was a super interesting conversation. And it's fun to see a friend you had in college and see where they've gone and just what they're doing. So that was really encouraging. But then this conversation has been on my mind for the last month and a half or so. So
Another Wheaton grad, right? Like lots of Wheaton
another Wheaton
connections
grad.
Oh,
here.
awesome!
Yes.
Cool.
That's
Yeah.
great. What's been changing my life? I mean, we're both kind of really on topic here today. I'm going on a different side of the topic, but I shared about the podcast Let's Read the Gospels earlier this year, so last season, but earlier this calendar year, and I just it kind of starts over every month reading through all four gospels, and I just started doing that with a couple of other people, and so we like text each other when we've listened to it as kind of not only accountability but like what stood out to you. And that's like so simple to do, but it is actually really profound to know that you're studying scripture with people, even when you're not like sitting next to each other talking about it, and that they see something different. And I'm, reminded from this conversation today that as we do that outside of our singular cultural context, we can even, enrich that experience more. So that's what's been changing my life lately. What about you, Steve?
Oh man, these are great answers. Mine's gonna sound boring.
No, it's okay. You
I
go
would
for
say,
it.
I mean, as I reflected on this, I think something that's changing my life lately is a recovery and sort of remembering that relationships are a big part of ministry, which sounds like such a no duh, but I think all of us, or a lot of us, get focused on tasks so much and
Sure.
checking
Yeah.
things off the list, and maybe especially during the pandemic, which was very long and very profound here in the Philippines in particular,
Yes.
lockdowns and
Yes.
so on. I think during that time, I realized it became a lot more task oriented, just sort of
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
maximize efficiency. And lately I've been reminded, long meetings and conversations with colleagues and students are not a distraction. That's actually a big part of what I'm here to do. So that's been a good mind shift for me.
That's not light or small, Steve. That's huge too. So, yeah, thank you so much for this conversation, for this book, for your work, Steve. We'll be sure to link to the book in the show notes and make sure to encourage other people to check that out. But thanks so much for this conversation today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's been a total privilege.
Okay, Kian, we gave away a book a few weeks ago. So, big question. Are we going to do another giveaway this week? I mean, I feel like this book would be really good for people to get in their hands. What do you think?
Oh, for sure. I think we definitely should do it.
I figured that you'd go along with that. Okay. So, how about if people email podcast@teachbeyond.org with one thing that stood out from today's episode? And don't forget to include your mailing address. And then we'll randomly pick a winner from those next Friday. So, if you're listening to this within the week of the episode releasing, you could be a winner.
That sounds like a perfect plan.
Cool. Okay. I'm excited.
It was so great to talk to Steve today. Steve, Heather, and I all serve with an organization called Teach Beyond. As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all he intends.
Want to learn more about Teach Beyond and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share this show with a friend. So be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.
The mystery word for this week is providing.